The relentless storm that battered the Pacific Northwest that night was not merely a weather event. It felt like a personal vendetta from the heavens, a deluge of biblical proportions designed to wash the sins of Seattle into the churning gray waters of the Puget Sound. My windshield wipers, rubber blades fighting a losing war against the torrent, slashed back and forth at a frantic rhythm. Yet they could barely carve a sliver of visibility through the sheet of water that coated the glass. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan until my knuckles turned a skeletal white, the material groaning softly under the immense pressure of my hands. These were hands that had once crushed opponents in the octagon, hands that had been wrapped in tape and leather, raised in victory under blinding arena lights while thousands chanted my name. But tonight, inside the claustrophobic cabin of my car, they were trembling with a type of fear I had never experienced inside a cage. Inside the cage, I knew my enemy. I knew the rules. Tonight, the enemy was invisible, and the rules had been rewritten by people who viewed human life as a disposable commodity. At precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, my headlights cut through the oppressive darkness and illuminated the imposing, wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate. The mansion sat perched high on a hill, overlooking the water, a sprawling architectural beast of glass, steel, and cold concrete that screamed of generational wealth and emotional detachment. Even through the deafening drumming of the rain on the roof of my car, I could hear the thumping bass of music bleeding out from the residence. Warm, golden light blazed from every floor-to-ceiling window, casting long, distorted rectangles onto the manicured, rain-soaked lawn. Inside that fortress, they were celebrating. They were toasting to their mergers, their acquisitions, their perfect, untarnished lives. I reached over to the passenger seat and placed my hand on the thermal container. Inside was a simple chicken pot pie, warm and smelling of thyme, sage, and a mother's love. Mia, my daughter, had called me 2 days ago, her voice barely a whisper over the phone line, confessing that she hadn't been able to keep any food down for nearly a week. She was 3 months pregnant, suffering from a debilitating case of hyperemesis gravidarum, and in her fragile state, the only thing her body craved was the comfort food I used to make her when she was a little girl recovering from a fever. I punched the access code into the keypad at the gate, my fingers slick with rain, but the small light on the panel blinked an angry red. Access denied. I tried again, punching the numbers with more force. Denied. A surge of anxiety tightened my chest like a physical blow. I parked the car right there, blocking the grand entrance, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The rain soaked me to the bone in seconds, the icy water running down my neck and plastering my hair to my face. But I was numb to the physical sensation. I ran toward the smaller pedestrian side gate, hidden within the hedges, which, by some miracle or perhaps the careless oversight of a catering staff member, was unlatched. I sprinted up the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching wetly under my boots, my breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air. As I neared the massive front door, the sounds of the party became distinct. I heard the clinking of crystal, the roar of raucous laughter, the artificial joy of people who had never known a day of true suffering. I rang the doorbell. Once. Twice. I waited, counting the seconds. I pounded on the solid oak with my fist, the thuds echoing dully. No answer. The music was too loud, a wall of sound drowning out my desperation. Something was wrong. That maternal instinct, the same primal sixth sense that used to warn me of an incoming roundhouse kick milliseconds before my eyes even registered the movement, was screaming at me. It was a siren wailing in my blood. I left the front porch, abandoning decorum, and navigated around the side of the house, moving through the mud toward the back patio, where the expansive windows offered a panoramic view of the grand living room. I peered through the rain-streaked glass, water streaming down my face like tears. The scene inside was a tableau of excess and indifference. Victoria Sterling, my daughter's mother-in-law and the matriarch of the Sterling shipping empire, was holding court in the center of the room. She was draped in a silver gown that cost more than my car, a crystal flute of vintage champagne in one hand, her other hand resting possessively, almost claw-like, on the shoulder of her son, Caleb. My son-in-law was throwing his head back, laughing at something a business associate had said, his face flushed with alcohol and self-satisfaction. They looked perfect. They looked like royalty. But my eyes scanned the room frantically, searching for the one face that mattered. Mia was nowhere to be seen. I continued around the perimeter of the house, moving toward the darker, more secluded part of the patio near the ornamental rose garden. The wind howled around the corner of the building, cutting through my coat. That was when I saw it. A lump of fabric on the slate stones. A shadow that didn't belong in the perfectly curated landscape. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, threatening to crack the bone. I rushed forward, my boots slipping on the wet stone, nearly losing my balance. Mia. She was kneeling on the freezing patio, exposed to the full, merciless fury of the storm. She was wearing a thin, sleeveless silk dress that clung to her shivering frame like a second skin, offering absolutely no protection against the 40-degree weather. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her midsection, shielding her small baby bump, her head bowed low as if in prayer or utter defeat. She was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered with a sound that cut through the noise of the wind and the rain, a sound of pure, unadulterated physical trauma. "Mia!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. I dropped the food container. The ceramic shattered on the stones, the warm pie spilling onto the cold mud, steam rising for a brief second before being extinguished by the rain. I fell to my knees beside her, the impact jarring my bad knee. But I didn't feel it. I pulled her into my arms. Her skin was like ice. Not just cold, but the kind of deep, penetrating chill that speaks of life fading away, the temperature of marble in a mausoleum. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. "Mom?" she whispered, the word barely forming on her frozen, stiff lips. "Mom, I didn't mean to disturb them." "What are you doing out here?" I cried, stripping off my heavy trench coat and wrapping it around her trembling shoulders, trying to rub some friction and warmth into her arms. "Why aren't you inside?" "Caleb," he said. "I was ruining the mood," she stammered, her voice breaking and barely audible over the storm. "He said my nausea was disgusting the guests. He told me to get some fresh air until I could control myself. But the door, when I turned back, it was locked." Rage. It wasn't just anger. It was a blinding, white-hot supernova that exploded in the center of my chest, burning away the fear, burning away the cold. It was the familiar fury of the fighter, the beast I had spent 20 years learning to cage and control, now unleashed with zero restraint. They had locked my pregnant daughter outside in a storm like a disobedient dog because her morning sickness was inconvenient for their cocktail party. They had left her to freeze while they drank champagne 10 feet away. I helped Mia to her feet, supporting her entire weight as she sagged against me, her legs too numb to work properly. We hobbled toward the French doors that led into the living room. I grabbed the handle and yanked. Locked. Through the glass, I saw Caleb glance in our direction. He saw us. He looked right at me. He saw his wife, soaking wet, blue-lipped, and freezing, supported by her mother, and he just turned away. He took a sip of his drink, said something to his mother, and turned his back on us. That was the moment Elena Vance, the patient mother, ceased to exist. In her place stood Elena, the Iron Vance, the undefeated champion who had never backed down from a fight in her life. I didn't knock. I didn't shout for them to open up. I shifted my weight, planting my left foot firmly on the slippery stone. I pivoted my hips, channeling every ounce of strength from my core, every ounce of hatred and protective fury, into my right leg. I unleashed a side kick that hit the locking mechanism of the double doors with the force of a battering ram. The sound was explosive, like a gunshot. Wood splintered, metal groaned and sheared, and the heavy glass doors flew open, banging violently against the interior walls. The music didn't stop immediately, but the conversation died instantly. The room went silent, save for the howling wind and rain blowing in behind me, carrying with it the scent of ozone and wet earth. I stood in the threshold, water dripping from my nose, my hair wild, holding my half-conscious daughter against my chest. The guests stared, mouths agape, pearls clutched in manicured hands. Victoria Sterling dropped her champagne glass. It hit the Persian rug with a dull thud, not breaking, just staining the expensive wool with bubbling liquid. "You animals," I growled. My voice was low, guttural, vibrating with a menace that made the nearest guests take an instinctive step back. Caleb looked at me, annoyance flickering in his eyes, completely misreading the danger he was in. "Elena, look at what you've done to the door. You're hysterical. Mia was just getting some air." "Getting air?" I screamed, my voice finally breaking free, echoing off the high ceilings. "She is hypothermic. She is pregnant with your child. She has been out there for hours." Victoria stepped forward, regaining her composure, her face settling into a mask of icy disdain. "Take her home then, if she is so fragile. She is clearly too weak to handle the responsibilities of being a Sterling wife. Look at her, making a scene in front of the investors. It is embarrassing." I looked at them. I looked at the expensive suits, the jewelry that cost more than a house, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Then I looked at my daughter, who was fading in my arms, her head lolling against my shoulder. There was no point in talking. Words were useless against monsters. Reasoning with them was like trying to reason with a landslide. "I am taking her," I said, my voice trembling not with fear, but with the gargantuan effort it took not to kill them right there in their living room. "And God help you all when I come back." I half-carried, half-dragged Mia back to the car, shielding her from the rain with my own body. I blasted the heater, stripping her of the wet, clinging silk, and wrapping her in the emergency wool blanket and my gym hoodie that I kept in the trunk. I drove like a madwoman, running red lights, honking at anyone in my way, the tires hydroplaning on the slick asphalt. The drive to Seattle Grace Hospital was a blur of panic and prayer. Mia was mumbling incoherently, clutching her stomach, crying out in pain that seemed to come from deep within her soul. "Hold on, baby. Hold on," I pleaded, tears finally spilling over my own cheeks, blinding me. When we crashed through the emergency room doors, the nurses swarmed us. I was screaming that she was pregnant, that she had been in the cold for hours. They loaded her onto a gurney. Wires were attached, monitors started beeping, and they wheeled her away behind double doors that swung shut with a finality that left me alone in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the waiting room. Hours passed. They felt like decades, like lifetimes. I paced the linoleum floor, my wet clothes drying stiff and uncomfortable against my skin. I couldn't sit. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb turning his back. I saw Victoria's sneer. I looked at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. I remembered the day Mia was born. I was 24, at the peak of my career. I had just won the national title. I was a weapon, forged in sweat and blood. But when they placed that tiny pink bundle in my arms, the fighting spirit, the need for violence, just evaporated. I looked at her tiny fingers and I wanted to protect her from everything. I retired 2 years later because I couldn't bear the thought of her seeing her mother bruised and bleeding. I wanted her to know softness, not the cage. I raised her to be kind, to be gentle, to play the piano and paint watercolors. I taught her to see the good in people. Had I made a mistake? Had I raised a lamb to be slaughtered by wolves? Had my desire to shield her from the harshness of the world left her defenseless against people like the Sterlings? The sound of footsteps snapped me out of my trance. A doctor approached me, looking grave. He scrubbed a hand over his tired face, his eyes filled with a professional sorrow that I knew too well. "Mrs. Vance?" "Yes," I choked out, stepping forward. Is the baby?" The doctor shook his head slowly, looking down at his clipboard. "I am so sorry. The hypothermia was severe. Her body went into shock. The extreme stress, combined with the drop in core temperature, triggered massive uterine contractions. We tried everything, but we couldn't stop the miscarriage." The world tilted on its axis. The fluorescent lights seemed to stretch and distort. A sound escaped my throat, a raw, wounded noise that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a future being erased. "Mia is alive," the doctor continued quickly, putting a steadying hand on my shoulder. "She is stable physically, but she is devastated. She is asking for you." Walking into that hospital room was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than any fight, harder than any training camp, harder than the day I buried my own parents. Mia lay there, small and pale against the white sheets, an IV line snaking into her bruised arm. She looked so young, so incredibly diminished. When she saw me, her face crumbled. "I lost him, Mom," she sobbed. A sound so broken it shattered my heart into dust. "I lost him." I held her while she cried, rocking her like I did when she was a baby. I stroked her hair and whispered useless comforts, absorbing her pain, all while a cold, hard resolve formed in my gut. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was negligence. This was cruelty. And they would pay. The next morning, the silence from the Sterling family was deafening. No one showed up, no one called, no flowers, no inquiries. Mia lay in bed, staring at the wall, hollowed out. "I need to call Caleb," she whispered around noon, her voice raspy from crying. "Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he thinks I'm just sick." "Mia," I said gently, trying to keep the venom out of my voice. "He knows. He's my husband, Mom. He loves me. It was just a mistake." Her denial was a survival mechanism. I knew that. But it infuriated me. I stepped out into the hallway and dialed Caleb's number. It went to voicemail. I dialed again. Voicemail. I called the Sterling house landline. A housekeeper answered, her voice tight, and told me Mrs. Sterling was unavailable and that I was not to call again. I drove back to the mansion. The broken doors were already boarded up with plywood. I pounded on the wood until my fists ached. Caleb finally opened the door, looking disheveled, smelling of stale alcohol and strong coffee. When he saw me, he didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed. "What do you want, Elena? We are dealing with the contractors for the door you destroyed. Do you know how much imported mahogany costs?" "Your son is dead," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Mia lost the baby last night." Caleb flinched, just for a second. A shadow crossed his face, a flicker of something that might have been humanity, but it was quickly replaced by a defensive, arrogant sneer. "Well, maybe if she hadn't run off into the rain like a drama queen, this wouldn't have happened. She was always too weak to carry a Sterling heir. My mother said she didn't have the constitution for it." I wanted to hit him. God, I wanted to hit him so bad my vision blurred red. I knew exactly where to strike to incapacitate him, exactly how much pressure to apply to break him. But I knew if I touched him, I would go to jail, and Mia needed me. I unclenched my fists. "You are a monster," I whispered, the realization chilling me. "I'm a man who is tired of his wife's histrionics," he spat back, closing the door slightly. "Tell Mia to contact my lawyer. I think this marriage has run its course." He slammed the door in my face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I went to the police. I went to a lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had been a fan of my fighting career and specialized in high-profile divorces. We filed a report for domestic abuse and criminal negligence. But the Sterlings were faster, they were richer, and they played dirty. 2 days later, while I was at the hospital with Mia, my house was broken into. It wasn't a robbery for valuables. My television was there, my jewelry box untouched, my cash jar still on the counter. But my laptop was gone. The physical folder where I kept Mia's medical records and the printed photos of the ultrasound was gone. And worse, the narrative began to shift. I turned on the local news in the hospital waiting room to see a family spokesperson for the Sterlings giving a statement on the steps of their headquarters. "We are deeply saddened by the mental health struggles of Caleb's estranged wife," the woman said smoothly, looking directly into the camera. "It is a tragedy when a woman suffers from a phantom pregnancy and uses it to manipulate a family. We hope she gets the psychiatric help she desperately needs." Phantom pregnancy? I stood up, shaking with rage, knocking my chair over. They were erasing the existence of my grandchild. They were painting Mia as crazy, as a hysterical woman who imagined a baby to trap a rich husband. It worked. The court of public opinion is fickle, and the Sterlings owned the narrative. Neighbors who used to wave at me now looked away when I walked down the street. I received hate mail calling me an enabler of a psycho and a gold digger. Mia saw the comments online before I could take her phone away. It nearly broke her completely. She stopped speaking. She just lay in the hospital bed, a shell of a person, convinced that maybe she was crazy. I felt like I was in the final round of a championship fight. I was losing badly. My eye was swollen shut, my ribs were broken, and I was out of breath. But you don't become a champion by quitting when it hurts. You wait for an opening. You wait for the opponent to make a mistake. That opening came in the form of a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Meet me at the Pike Place Market, under the big clock. 1 hour, come alone. I hesitated. It sounded like a trap. But desperation makes you bold. I went. Standing under the famous neon clock, amidst the tourists throwing fish and the smell of the ocean, was a woman in a hooded raincoat and dark sunglasses. She was shivering, though it wasn't particularly cold. It took me a moment to recognize her. It was Juliana Sterling, Caleb's younger sister, the quiet one. The one who was always sent away to boarding schools in Switzerland, the one who never smiled in the family photos. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "Juliana, what is this? Are you here to deliver another message from your mother?" She flinched as if I had slapped her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. "My mother and brother. They think they can buy the truth. They think people are disposable. They think they are gods." "Why are you helping us?" I asked, taking the drive. It felt heavy in my palm, heavier than plastic and metal had any right to be. Because before Mia, it was a girl named Sarah. Before her, it was Emily. Caleb destroys everything he touches, and my mother sweeps up the pieces and pays people off. Juliana looked up, and I saw a deep, old pain in her eyes, a lifetime of silence. I can't be silent anymore. I'm done being an accomplice. On that drive, it's the security footage. The raw file from the patio cameras. My mother told the security team to wipe the servers, but I made a copy first. My hand closed tight around the metal. "Thank you," I choked out, feeling the first spark of hope I'd had in weeks. "Don't thank me yet. Just bury them," she said, pulling her hood up. Then she vanished into the crowd of tourists, a ghost in the machine of her family's destruction. I ran to Sarah Jenkins' office. We watched the footage together. It was horrifying, and it was perfect. The high-definition night vision camera captured everything. It showed Caleb pushing Mia out the door. It showed him locking it. It showed Mia knocking, begging to be let in. It showed the timestamp ticking away. It showed the guests inside, laughing, eating, completely ignoring the woman dying on their doorstep. It showed Victoria checking her reflection in the glass of the door, seeing Mia, and closing the curtains. 2 hours. She was out there for 2 hours. "This is the smoking gun," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "But we don't just give this to the police. The Sterlings have judges in their pocket. They can delay a trial for years. We need to try them in a court they can't bribe." "We need the public," I said, understanding her plan. "Exactly." The next day, Caleb Sterling held a press conference. He stood on the steps of the King County Courthouse, looking somber and aggrieved. He wore a black suit. He actually squeezed out a tear for the cameras. "My wife is very sick," he told the assembled press, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "There was never a baby. It was a delusion brought on by stress. We tried to get her help, but her mother interfered. It is a tragic situation, and we ask for privacy." I was watching from the back of the crowd, standing next to Sarah. My phone was buzzing in my hand. It was time. "Now," Sarah whispered. We uploaded the video. We didn't just post it. We sent it to every news outlet, every blog, every influencer who had covered the story. We tagged it The Sterling Truth. The reaction was instantaneous. Phones in the crowd started pinging. Reporters looked down at their devices, their eyebrows shooting up, their eyes widening. The murmur turned into a roar. One reporter, a young woman from a local station who had been skeptical of Caleb from the start, shouted out, "Mr. Sterling, if there was no baby, why does this video show you locking your pregnant wife outside in a storm for 2 hours. Caleb froze. His somber mask slipped, revealing the panic underneath. What? No, that's doctored. That's fake news. Another reporter held up his tablet, showing the footage to the cameras. It's time-stamped, sir. We can see you. We can see your mother drinking wine while your wife freezes. We can see the date. The crowd turned. The sympathy evaporated in a split second, replaced by a collective, visceral disgust. The energy shifted from respectful silence to a mob's anger. Caleb's lawyer grabbed his arm and tried to pull him away, but the questions were coming like bullets now. Did you know she was hypothermic? Did you know she miscarried the next day? Is it true you stole her medical records? How can you call yourself a man? Caleb stumbled back, his arrogance shattering. He looked around for his mother, but Victoria wasn't there. She was safe in her mansion, or so she thought. He was alone. The fallout was nuclear. Within 24 hours, the Sterlings were the most hated family in Seattle. The police reopened the investigation, armed with the video and the newly recovered medical records from the hospital server records we subpoenaed to prove the pregnancy was real. The phantom pregnancy lie collapsed under the weight of undeniable facts. The trial 3 months later was a spectacle. I sat in the front row, holding Mia's hand. She was still thin, still pale, but her eyes were clear. She was wearing a simple blue dress, head held high. She was no longer the victim. She was the survivor. Juliana took the stand. She testified against her own family with a quiet dignity that brought tears to the jury's eyes. She spoke of the cycle of abuse, the cover-ups, the emotional manipulation. She looked at her brother, who was sitting at the defense table looking small and defeated, and she didn't flinch. Then came the medical examiner. He detailed the physiological effects of the cold on Mia's body. He confirmed, without a shadow of a doubt, that the stress and hypothermia caused the loss of the fetus. Caleb didn't testify. He knew it was over. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Caleb Sterling was found guilty of reckless endangerment, domestic abuse, and gross negligence resulting in bodily harm. He was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. It wasn't enough for the life he took, but it was justice. Victoria Sterling never faced a jury. On the morning she was due to testify, she suffered a massive stroke brought on by the stress of the collapsing empire and the public shaming. She was left paralyzed, trapped in her own body, unable to speak, unable to control the company she had sacrificed her humanity to build. She spent her remaining days in a high-end care facility, staring out the window at the rain, alone with her thoughts. A year has passed since the trial. The rain in Seattle hasn't stopped. It never really does, but it feels different now. It doesn't feel oppressive. It feels cleansing, washing away the grime of the past. Mia didn't go back to playing the piano. She said the music reminded her too much of the parties at the Sterling house, of the fake laughter and the clinking glasses. Instead, she picked up a paintbrush. She started an art therapy program for women who have survived domestic violence. She leased a small loft in Pioneer Square and calls the studio The Shelter. It's a place where women can come, be warm, be safe, and turn their pain into something beautiful. I help her run the place. I'm not fighting in cages anymore, and I'm not fighting rich bullies. I'm fighting a different battle now, helping these women find their strength again. I teach a self-defense class in the evenings, showing women that their bodies belong to them and no one else. Juliana moved to New York. She sends us postcards every month. She's studying law at Columbia. She wants to be a prosecutor. She wrote to us saying she wants to make sure the bad guys don't get away just because they have money. She has finally found her own voice. One afternoon, I found Mia sitting on the balcony of our small apartment, watching a storm roll in over the Puget Sound. The gray clouds were heavy, and the water was choppy, but she wasn't afraid. She was drinking tea, her hand resting absently on her stomach. The grief is still there. It always will be. You don't get over the loss of a child. You just learn to grow around the hole it leaves in your heart. "Mom," she said, not looking away from the clouds. "Yeah, honey? I used to think I was weak because I couldn't handle their world, because I couldn't handle the cold, because I let them treat me that way." I sat down beside her and took her hand. "You survived the cold, Mia. You survived the storm. You walked through hell and came out the other side creating art. That makes you stronger than they ever were. They broke at the first sign of trouble. You endured. She looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, her smile reached her eyes. It was a genuine smile, full of light. We survived, she corrected. I wrapped my arm around her, resting my head on her shoulder. Yes, we did. I look back at that night, at the door I kicked down, and I realize something profound. We are taught from a young age that silence is polite, that enduring suffering is a virtue, especially for women. We are told to keep the peace, to not make a scene, to smile through the pain. But sometimes peace is just a mask for oppression. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is disturb the peace. Sometimes you have to kick the damn door down. Because if you don't speak up for the truth, if you don't scream against the storm, the rain will drown you. And looking at my daughter now, painting a canvas with bright, defiant colors, surrounded by other women finding their power, I know that our voices are the only shelter that truly matters. We are no longer victims of the storm. We are the ones who learn to dance in the rain.